Welcome to the Sociable Dog Pod, the podcast for anyone who wants to know more about the extraordinary relationship we have with our dogs and why we don't always understand each other. We'll be digging into the roots of dog behaviour so we can get to know our best friends better and make our lives with them a little richer. We'll be busting some of those sticky myths about why they do what they do, exploring how they learn and trying to interpret their language. We'll talk science, we'll share stories, have some laughs and make some interesting discoveries all along the way. I'm Si Wooler and I've been working with dogs and their humans for more than 15 years. So let's talk dogs. This week we're talking about a problem that quite a few people experience with their dog. That problem is resource guarding. Resource guarding is, as the name suggests, the guarding of anything that the dog finds valuable. That might be people, food, objects like socks, balls, toys of other kinds, shoes, found objects, you name it. People can be both cared for as group members and a valuable resource at the same time. It might not even be people or things. It can be locations such as furniture or rooms, dog beds, entrances, the garden, etc., etc. So that's what it is. But let's just nail head on what it's not. It's not your dog trying to dominate you. There's no evidence in behaviour science that your dog is in this constant conflict with you for superiority and dominance of your family. They don't have an innate need to be the authority figure. The mere kudos of being in charge is a uniquely human condition. So what drives resource guarding? It's not them plotting a palace coup or trying to take over. It's the worry of loss. That's why when someone says to me, my dog is trying to dominate me, I ask, over what? Because there's usually a resource of some kind involved, assuming the issue isn't fear of personal injury. They're not trying to dominate you, they're trying to maintain control of a resource that they think is under threat. And that's a big deal to a dog. Imagine how you would feel if someone was trying to steal your car or burgle your house and steal your new TV and stereo. You would be angry and defensive, probably call the police and shout a lot. You're simply trying not to lose things that have cost you money and are therefore valuable to you. This is actually really good news. Now, I know, it may not feel like it, but here's the thing. This means that you are not in a fight for supremacy and authority. You are already in charge, and your dog has no intentions on your position in the household. After all, they're not very good at opening fridges, no opposable thumbs, and they're even worse at refilling them, no credit cards. So rest assured, on that front, it's all good. The world order is intact. And you don't have to pretend to eat your dog's dinner or stand in their bed for 5 minutes a day or ensure you leave the house before them or prohibit going upstairs and sleeping on the bed if you don't want to, provided they don't guard the bed, that is.
Fine, so they're not aiming to overthrow us, which is nice. Now, I can see why a dog might worry about complete strangers taking the stuff they value. But why do they think their family, the people they live with, are a threat to their food or their stuff or their place on the sofa? After all, we're the ones that provided in the first place.
Yep, I get that. Resource guarding has a significant genetic content. It's normal dog behaviour designed to ensure that important resources are kept under control. Not all dogs do it, but those who do can be helped. It isn't true to say that genetic predispositions cannot be modified. Over time, too, they learn that the strategy they adopt to keep people or other dogs away from their stuff actually works, and so it's maintained. Now, as far as family members are concerned, some of them may be viewed as valuable resources themselves, and so are the focus of guarding behaviour from other members of the family. But for the most part, the answer is simpler. It's that family are around more and so are more likely to be guarded against. It's not about the source of the resource or its abundance. It's about the risk of loss once it's been established as belonging to them.
Is there anything we can do to minimise the likelihood that dogs will guard in this way? I'm thinking about the things people talk about with puppies, and you may see it in puppy classes where you're taking their food bowl away while they're eating and giving it back, or exchanging toys, things like that?
Yeah, actually, yes. Things can be done, at least to improve the prospects that you won't encounter resource guarding. And you can do it both with puppies and older dogs who don't guard, just as a belts and braces approach. You can do toy exchanges for tasty treats before returning the toy, as you suggest, and you can run through the criteria steps of a food guarding protocol with both puppies and older dogs. Making sure that puppies have good opportunity to develop good acquired bite inhibition through regular play dates, etc., will also be helpful. And while the good news is that we don't have to worry about them overthrowing the household regime, it's still an intimidating problem to face. Dogs are designed to be quite efficient at guarding resources. Sharp pointy teeth, growly, snarly, snarly. It can particularly be a problem if it's about stuff like furniture or children's toys and so forth. The good news is it isn't fear, which, as we know, is incredibly easy to install and much, much harder to resolve. But there's even more good news, if you can call it that. If you had to have a behaviour problem involving aggressive behaviour, and I'd rather you didn't have, but let's imagine you did, resource guarding is the one you would want. It responds really well to training. So hurrah.
Now, I'm just going to stop you there. It's all very fine and dandy for you to say hurrah. It's not fear, so it's easier to fix. But for people facing it, it can look and feel the same and feel just as scary. And I'm anticipating here that it can take an awful lot of diligence and vigilance to train out.
Yeah, that is true. But resource guarding, as opposed to out-and-out fear, despite the fact that they might use the same behaviour to deal with it, is more readily defined as anxiety. The anxiety about losing something valuable. If they lose it, they live to fight another day. It's not the end of the world. It's upsetting, sure, but you're not dead. And if you thought there was a chance you might be, you'd most likely relinquish the resource, and then you're into fight, flight, or freeze mode, which is a different podcast.
So basically, it's about intensity.
Well, I don't want to minimise it. What I really want to happen as a result of this podcast is for people to see their dog's inclination to guard anything as worry rather than defiance. If you can do that, I would wager you'll feel less annoyed by it and be more inclined to help them in a calm and kindly way. I want to be clear here, though. While resource guarding resolves well in many cases, it's not always easy, and it's certainly long-winded and methodical if you want to be sure of nailing it entirely. There are prognostically significant variables like how specific the problem is, meaning do they guard only one category of resource or are there more? Is their mouth good, meaning how hard do they bite if you know this at all? How big are they? And are they proven to be impulsive? If they don't show protracted warnings, then they can be explosive. All of this can have an impact on the prospect of success. Not to mention that the environment might have a huge effect on how safe it is to have the dog in the house, or a temp behaviour mod, the presence of babies or small children, the elderly or infirm, and so on. People's lives are complex, and working through a resource guarding program takes time, energy, and opportunity.
So how do you begin to help? You say it's potentially more resolvable than fear aggression, but on behalf of anyone who's had to face the prospect of snaps or even bites when they're trying to take a food bowl away or pick up a toy, it's still a challenging prospect.
Yep, that's true. But there is a standard operating procedure we can follow. As always, though, we stress that this podcast isn't going to be the answer to fixing resource guarding. This podcast, as with all our podcasts, is designed to give you a better understanding of the problem so that you can go on and learn more, preferably from a qualified and credentialed professional who can work through the process with you. Now, when it comes to prospects for success, there are some factors which make the likelihood of early progress more likely. The ease with which you can identify the trigger or guarded thing for one. If it feels like sometimes it's this, but other times it's that, or if they guard people and food and objects and found contraband, things they come across on walks, then that's going to be more challenging. If your dog has body handling issues, they don't like to be touched, that's an added layer of complexity. Some guarders don't give you much of a tip-off that a resource is present or that you have come too close to it, and will lunge or snap or bite before you have much of a chance to correct your error. But others have what we call protracted warnings, which I mentioned earlier, such as freezing, hard eye, growling, snarling, or snapping. They might use all or some of these in order as signals that escalation will follow if you don't back off. It's really, really important to become attuned to these. Positive indicators might be a good training history, so they're well versed in learning and can pick up new skills quickly. If you know something of your dog's bite pressure when and if they do, that will help to give you confidence. Although if you're in any doubt, then muzzle training is something that can be done easily and provides an added level of confidence and security. Though clearly you can't get a food guarder to wear a muzzle while eating.
Okay, for some, and it's a minority of dogs, I think, as you mentioned earlier, there can be a range of things that they guard that seem entirely inexplicable, totally unpredictable, and that makes it feel overwhelming. It can be pebbles in the garden, the magazine you just put down on the floor, apparently anything and everything. In these really, really severe cases, is it worth a vet visit?
Yes, we touched on this earlier, but yes. There are some extreme cases where the guarding is so extreme that a vet consultation would be entirely justified. In fact, I would encourage them for any behaviour that involves aggressive behaviour, but meds are not typical in dealing with resource guarding. That said, some cases have the feel that guarding is less of a predisposition and more of a symptom of a different underlying anxiety.
Okay, well, let's get back to how you might help more common resource guarders with less complex problems. What do we need to know and what do we think about doing?
Well, here are the broad strokes. I can't cover exactly what to do in every circumstance because it's a very incremental process, but here are some principles. First, what you don't do. You should avoid using aversives at all costs. By aversives, I mean anything that your dog doesn't like or might cause them fear or pain. That might be something as apparently innocuous to us as rattle bottles or squirt bottles, air horns. It includes lead jerks or telling them off or collars that apply shocks or choking. It may seem normal or the right thing to do to chastise our dogs in some way for behaviour that is distressing to us or is unacceptable to us or even causes us damage. But here's the thing, you're going to make it worse. The only way that any of these things mentioned are going to change behaviour is if our dogs want to escape or avoid them. They have to find it alarming or scary or harmful in order to change behaviour. But the behaviour it changes isn't the one you're expecting. You've taught them that it is bad to warn you that they're upset. After all, snarking and barking and growling is their way of saying, go away or get away from my stuff. You've done nothing to change their attitude to the perceived threat. Indeed, you've become a bigger one and their behaviour just got harder to predict. And you don't need to resort to aversives. Instead, you want to demonstrate to them that there is no risk to either them or their stuff. By the time you've finished, your dog should no longer see people approaching their stuff as threatening, and so will have no cause to guard. That will even extend to being able to easily remove things that might previously have been guarded. Right? The other myth to bust is that making the resource plentiful reduces either the risk or the likelihood. It doesn't. Dogs who have ready and near constant access to toys or food or resting places of their choice may still guard. Now, management is an important part of dealing with resource guarding. You're going to want to avoid guarding rehearsals, for one thing, and reduce the risk of errors that could result in injury for another. Management options might include only allowing access to rooms where there is guarded furniture when you're going to go through training steps, and so can control both your dog and the environment so that you don't go beyond what the dog can do without incident. It might mean muzzle training, crate training, or limited access to toys or objects if you aren't training. Remember, this isn't likely to be for life, just until you fix the problem. Management could be all you choose to do, of course, so don't go near the dog when they're eating, for example, but generally most people find this challenging and error-prone, so opt for either full-on training or a combination of the two. That brings us to the most common training solutions for guarders. The main one is Sociable Dog's old favourite, systematic desensitisation and counter-conditioning. Remember that resource guarding is an anxiety problem, so we want to change the attitude of the dog to having people approach or be close to their stuff. Change their feeling about that from unhappy to happy.
And what makes them happy?
Well, you need to take it slow and choose a setup and a starting point that sets you up for success. There are a couple of criteria to consider in this. Distance, how close the resource is to the dog, and value, how much they prize the resource. The closer a guarded resource is to the dog, the more valuable it becomes. So the process in the case of guarded objects is for you to set up your training session so the guarded object is at distance from the dog when you approach it, and then position it incrementally closer, the dog getting plenty of reward every time you approach the object. People guarders would start with the valued, important, guarded person further away, with the person being guarded against, making approaches at that distance.
So if your dog guards a toy, you set things up so that you start with the toy closer to you and quite a few meters distance from the dog, and you approach the toy, reward the dog, retreat and repeat, and then you start again with the toy just a little bit closer to the dog and so on.
Yeah. Second criteria, value. You would also typically start with a situation where the dog doesn't guard and go through your steps before adding difficulty, so to speak. So for a food guarder, you would start with an empty bowl and you would approach and add a morsel of food. With an object guarder, you would start with objects that are not guarded or less valued. In all cases, you're making the approach rewarding, dropping something tasty and looking for that positive conditioned emotional response that we've talked about before, a relaxed expression, tail wag, look in anticipation of the treat. You're going to need to try and establish what's hot and what's not, so that you can decide how many different criteria you need to cover in your planned process. Angle of approach may matter, as might the speed. Eye contact might have an impact, and so will need to be factored in as a step.
Wow, that sounds like an awful lot of steps. How long does this take?
Well, it is a lot of steps, and there are even more in truth, because once you've done it with the least guarded object, for example, you go up to the next object on the list, and the next, repeating all of the steps for each. You should see them go through steps more quickly for each, but you should still do it. You might also have a situation where men are guarded against more than women, so you have women in the family do it first, all of them, through all of the steps with all of the objects, followed by the men, and then do some strangers into the mix to make sure that generalization is occurring. Then you need to test it without warming them up first, what we call cold trials. So resource guarding responds well to training, but that doesn't mean that it's quick, and ultimately the speed is going to be different for each dog. Remember that you're looking for a positive emotional response to each step in the process before moving on. So weeks, if not months, is more likely than days.
You mentioned generalisation there, and I know that dogs don't generalise well. They think of all different circumstances as specific. When you have fixed this, in inverted commas, does it stay fixed? So let's say you've gone through this whole process with the family in your home, and the dog is no longer guarding his food bowl from anyone in the family. But hey, you're going away for the weekend, and so you ask a friend or a relative or a dog sitter to come and take care of the dog. Might the dog go back to guarding?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is yes and no. Like most behaviours, this needs maintaining. So some occasional cold trial tests are in order to both keep it up and ensure that it's solid. By occasional, I mean weekly. The odd object approach while it's in their possession and an exchange for a tasty treat before returning it. A casual walk up to the food bowl and dropping an extra prize in. Things like that. If you see any hint of guarding like stiffening, whale eye or growling, then run through a few steps until you get back up to speed. That won't take anywhere like as long as it did the first time, by the way, which I'm sure comes as a relief. And I would just say that ensuring that you've done some tests over time with unfamiliar people is going to give you more confidence about that dog sitter.
Okay, the fact that it starts to get a bit quicker is surely a relief. We've talked about dogs guarding things from people. What about dogs in the same household guarding things from each other? You can't apply the same approach there, can you?
You can. Yeah, you can. The principle is the same, just applied a little differently to accommodate the complexity of having two dogs in the mix. You can also take the view that if it's infrequent and non-injurious, that management is the preferred option, or you can leave them to work out a strategy to avoid the problem. You can also train behaviours for pay that can't be performed at the same time as guarding, and by default develop a positive emotional response to the guarded dog being close to the resource. Here's a last thought. Sometimes what people think is guarding is actually something else, fear aggression. Sometimes people think they're seeing resource guarding, most commonly people guarding, when they're really witnessing fear aggression. That's when you hear people talk about the dog protecting or defending a person from danger. It can be, and being social animals, they're likely to protect us as part of their social group, but fear is about self-preservation. Resource guarding is about something different. It's really when a dog warns off others, either people or dogs, from someone who is a valued resource, even from familiar people or dogs, and despite them being pro-social at all other times. In other words, if they welcome visitors, play with other dogs in the park and so on, but are hostile to approaches by others to their valued human, that isn't about protecting from danger. They've already established that the person or dog isn't dangerous. That's about protecting their special person from loss, their loss. They're concerned that the valued person is going to be taken away, or what they have will be taken away.
Okay, so what separates fear of people from guarding people from other people? It kind of seems like it's a bit the same. Zoom in a little on that for me, would you?
Yeah, well, the difference for me is, once again, outcomes, or the anticipated outcome. In fear of people, the motivation is to escape or avoid coming into contact with someone or something that is going to cause me harm, possibly even kill me, but certainly injure me and cause me pain, right? Fear generates behaviour which is about personal survival. For our purposes, I'm inclined to lump anything that meets that test into one category of fear. That's fear of people, dogs, plastic bags blowing in the wind, cars on the street, loud noises. That's all about, I'm going to die. You're going to use the same approach to deal with it, which is building positive associations. We've talked about that before. Essentially, the difference is in the severity of outcome and the fact that the focus isn't on the person, but on the resource. The trigger isn't the presence of a scary thing. As we've mentioned, resource guarding against familiar people is common in dogs who exhibit no fear of people, but the proximity of people to a valued resource. That means we can, once we've done our prognostic checklist, so to speak, predict outcomes more reliably. So that's an introduction to resource guarding. Now, as we've said before, it's only an introduction to how the thing works, rather than a guide to how it's done. So if you think you have a resource guarding problem, look for a qualified force-free professional in your area or online to help you. And good luck. Now, we've had some requests for a separation anxiety pod, and we're going to do one of those, but we're going to do it with one of the many separation anxiety professionals that I know. And so we have yet to schedule that, but we'll let you know as soon as we do. Bye now.